Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi!
Hello friends, it's Nandi. I'm back again with another video, and probably one that you're seeing in a flurry of activity from my channel. There's a lot of content that I'm recording at the moment, so I'm sorry if this is less polished than usual, as I've just got slightly less time to do things. I think of the videos that I've released, this is probably going to be the most useful one, as it covers Mortarion, the newest guild boss to come to Tacticus, and somebody who I believe is going to be the single hardest guild raid boss in the game, by quite some margin. So stay tuned, watch everything, because there's lots of useful tips and tricks here. As well as at the end, I'm going to be covering a bug that I've discovered in testing that I have highlighted to the devs and will be fixed in a future patch. However, for the coming weeks, this should be something that you're aware of, and certainly something to look to take advantage of if you want to make good progress in your raids. I'll go briefly into Mortarion's lore because it is interesting. He was one of the 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind, and was scattered across the galaxy due to an event that we now know was due to the Chaos Gods. He landed on Barbarous, which was a world covered in poison and poisonous fog, where the most advanced technology was that of steam power. And a lot of Barbarous and Mortarion's story was how he came to challenge the leader of that world in a penultimate battle for supremacy. However, Mortarion was on his knees, almost defeated by this enemy, known as High Overlord Nikaer. But eventually the Emperor of Mankind stepped in to deliver the final crushing blow and defeat Overlord Nikaer. This act ended up crippling Mortarion's confidence, and he held a grudge against the Emperor of Mankind for denying him the battle that would have seen him worthy of greatness. And that moment of lore and that moment of history is what gave seed to Mortarion to defect to the Chaos Gods, and indeed the Chaos God Nurgle, for which he has become the Demon Prince of the Death Guard. With the lore out of the way, I thought we should just jump straight in and have a look at the boss and his primes. So we'll start by having a look at Nauseous Rotbone, which is one of the primes, and on screen you can see the effects that killing the prime would have. Don't worry if you didn't catch that, because I'll go over it in more detail later on. Rotbone's traits are immune, boss adjutant, which is something we've seen before, and again I'll go over in more detail later on. Contagions of Nurgle, which is a feature that the Death Guard in-game currently have. He's a healer, again a feature of Rotbone as in-game at the moment, and he's resilient. His ability Tainted Narcethium and Revitalizing Malignancy are again both healing abilities that we're familiar with from game. In terms of sort of summoned minions, he's got a Blight Terminator that functions very similarly to Maladus, and he's got Poxwalkers. And both of these units also have the Contagions of Nurgle trait, which stacks with each other to create an even more powerful and lethal armor debuff aura. So we'll go into battle here, and I just want to show you a couple of things about this fight and demonstrate how it'll go. So I've chosen a Tau team here, assisted by Ulf, and all of the characters you see on screen at the moment are Diamond 1 with legendary equipment, and they're all level 50 with level 50 skills. So this just gives you a flavor for how strong the enemy units are in terms of bringing diamond units in. And for reference, this is at legendary 4 difficulty. So nothing too exciting so far, and indeed, you know, Nauseous Rotbone in a lot of ways is just a sort of tank and spank boss, to use some old verbiage from World of Warcraft, if any of you ever played that game. He looks to be pretty tanky, and you know, you can see that even bringing all of these different, you know, Diamond 1 units, we're still not making a huge dent in his health. However, he does have that boss adjutant trait, so what you're going to see at the end of each round is he's going to take damage, an extra he's going to take an extra 1% damage based on how many times he's been hit. You can see that his Contagions of Nurgle aura at the moment is only 1 hex deep, so he's just affecting adjacent enemies. And after we've attacked him at the end of his turn, we've got several ticks there for 4.8k for end of turn damage reduction due to boss adjutant. Next thing to look at is the second prime, Corrodius Achebile. I'm going to show you here what defeating him does, but don't worry if you can't catch all of this, because I'm going to go over all of it again in more detail later on in text format. In terms of what he does, he's got immune, he's got contagions of Nurgle, again that characteristic Nurgle trait, and resilience, so nothing new. Skills, we've got Cursed Plague Bell, which we also see for the Corrodius playable character model in game. And then next up we see the Wrathful Dead, so this is a new feature that we're seeing for this prime, and on every turn he spawns 7 Poxwalkers. Defeating a Poxwalker does direct damage to Corrodius, and he also summons Poxwalkers in his aura, and really just flooding the board with Poxwalkers is going to be the mainstay of how you defeat this guy. He doesn't have that boss adjutant feature, but as you'll see very shortly, these Poxwalkers are pretty lethal and get pretty overwhelming very quickly. So we see a couple on the board already before we've even started engaging with him, and he's hiding up there on the top right hand side of the screen like a coward against the Tau. So there we go, turn 1, lots of Poxwalkers spawned. Revas takes out a few of them with her active Overwatch, but you can see that even despite that, there's tons of Poxwalkers here. So we make some effort at trying to clear them up with our units, and you can see that every time we kill a Poxwalker, Corrodius is taking about 2,000 damage. But if you manage to catch his health bar up at the top of the screen, he's got 500,000 health, and killing a Poxwalker takes out 2,000 of that. So you're going to have to kill a lot of Poxwalkers if you want to do any meaningful damage to this guy. And there you go, turn 2, these Poxwalkers are just one-shotting our units. When they kill a unit, they are spawning more Poxwalkers. So you can see very, 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 very quickly how it's easy to get overwhelmed in this battle. The other thing that we notice is that these Poxwalkers, if you're adjacent to them, they're applying the Nurgle debuff Contagions of Nurgle. So you can see that Revas there has a minus armor debuff. And my squad of 5 that started out so healthy with some additional summons is already down to 3 units. We've only done 20,000 damage, and the board is full of Poxwalkers. Now, one thing I wanted to point out here that was interesting in my testing was just how strong Ulf seems to be against this particular setup. So, Onshi's going to die shortly, and then it's just going to be Ulf against Corrodius and the Poxwalkers. And you can see that every time a Poxwalker turns up, Ulf is just chopping them down, chopping them down, chopping them down, and each time he does so, he is doing 2,000 damage to Corrodius. And there you go, the rest of the battle plays out fairly unexcitedly, but I just want to show you just how good Ulf is here. Just chop, 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 and all this out of turn damage is fantastic because it's all just adding up on Corrodius and doing so much to him. Easily the MVP of this fight, and in fact Ulf performs so well here compared to the other Tau that I thought I had to just do another video and show you guys more of Ulf and possibly just take a slightly different approach to things. So what we're going to do here is try and set up with a sort of more defensive viewpoint rather than sending all of our units forward to Corrodius, which we know ends badly as you get overwhelmed by Poxwalkers. What happens if we set up a more defensive formation with some Overwatch units and Ulf, hopefully in the effort of just picking up these Poxwalkers and almost playing it a little bit like an onslaught battle where enemy after enemy and wave after wave comes up against you and you just have to defend and survive for as long as possible. So here again, we've got loads of Poxwalkers coming out, the Overwatch mechanics coming in useful in terms of picking them off as they approach you. And we are very much sitting in the corner, apart from sending Ulf, the undefeatable Space Wolf, up forward. So the rest of our units are sitting back. Revas has had her active recharge by Onshi. We're going to set up another turn of that, and then just try and pick off as many of these Poxwalkers as possible. So again, loads of units popping up, but we've got more Overwatch this time. We've got Ulf in a position to deal some damage if anyone tries to attack him. And already compared to the last battle, this looks infinitely better in terms of survivability and the amount of drones we have summoned and the amount of damage we've done at this stage to Corrodius is also vastly improved. And you can see there when we're, I think I used Azrael's active there to do a load of damage, which is pretty powerful. But you can see that targeting the Corrodius directly only does about 2000 damage anyway, so you're almost better off targeting the Poxwalkers directly, or if you can do some sort of area of effect damage, then that's going to be fantastic. And there we go, just Ulf proving to be an absolute MVP in this battle. And we've got, 3 rounds to go, and we've already dealt the same amount of damage as we did in the first run. So I think, generally speaking, the approach to this is going to be better as a more sort of defensive approach, and killing off as many Poxwalkers as you can, and putting a heavy damage dealer like Ulf, who's just mechanically built to fight lots and lots and lots of summons. And that's it. I mean, the rest of this battle plays out in the manner you'd expect, but you can see that the benefits of having Overwatch units and the benefits of playing defensively, and also the benefits of having Ulf, which I think are fantastic against this Prime. I'll leave that there and we can move on. So finally, we're going to move on and have a look at Mortarion himself, the big bad Guild Raid Boss. First thing to see is he is massive. He is 7 hexes large. And we'll have a quick look at his traits as well. There's nothing new that you haven't seen before. Immune, Contagions of Nurgle, Demon, Flying, and he's a Psyker, and he's also got big target. So these are all traits that we're familiar with in the game already. In terms of stats, you can see his armor stats 670, but this is reflected at level 4 legendary after we've killed both the primes. So his block is there. He's got an active ability called Reaping Scythe, which does chain damage in melee and preferentially targets Psykers. Lantern is probably the ability you'll see the most. He seems to cast it the most often. It's a 3x3 hex that you'll see in action shortly, which suppresses enemies and then does damage in the area the turn after. Mortarion's Plague Wind is a psychic attack. It's identical to Typhus's attack that we've already seen in game. And Arch Contaminator is his passive ability, which does direct damage to adjacent enemies, and they also take a bonus 15 to 20% of their max health, and summons take double damage. Host of Plagues is where when a unit dies, Poxwalkers are summoned, and Revoltingly Resilient is the sort of anti-multi-hit mechanic that Mortarion brings to the game. So every hit beyond the first 3 hits starts to exponentially reduce damage. And again, don't worry if you didn't catch all of that. I go through it all in slide form later on. What I just want to show you here is gameplay footage and how it all manifests when things happen in game. So he almost always seems to cast this spell on turn 1. I'm not sure if it's coded that way, like Ghazghkull has pre-coded turns, or if I've just been really sort of random or lucky or whatever you want to call it with my testing. But it always seems to open with the Lantern, and he always seems to cast his 3x3 Miasma. What you can see here is Tiark does a huge amount of damage actually, 5,000 odd, and that's because of his passive ability, Hunters Beyond Death, which does more damage to Psykers. So he's a huge amount of damage compared to other characters, as you'll see shortly, but by going into melee, he's affected by Contagions of Nurgle. And you can see there Mortarion being a Psyker, he does around 800 less damage by being affected by level 80 Tiark trait. And that 5,000 damage is compared to 1,100 by Ravas, and similarly low numbers across the board. Shozile seems to do quite well, 2.5k. And there you go, turn 2, this is with Mortarion having had both of his primes killed. He's cast 2 spells and my entire team is decimated. What I want to do here is just demonstrate to you Arch Contaminator, which does a huge amount of direct damage to melee and melee units. So you can see there Azrael in melee, and at the start of Mortarion's turn, he just dies straight away to that direct damage, which is huge, even at just 1 hit. And then our Brave Tau are just going to stay and fight for the rest of the battle, but you can see that, even full prime kills, every turn Mortarion is basically killing one of your units, if not more. So super powerful boss, and we're going to have a look at his skills in more detail shortly. Right, bit of a whirlwind tour, but hopefully you're keeping up and enjoying what I'm showing you. So Mortarion is huge, he's bad, he's hard, he is going to be difficult, and there's no two ways around that. The first thing to point out is that he has a massive armor stat. What you can see there on screen is his 6,700 armor at Legendary 4 without any of his primes being killed. So, you know, this is quite easily the highest armor in the game, and you're not going to be able to approach him or attack him without reducing that armor significantly. The good news is that killing both primes brings his armor down by 90%. On screen, you can also see his traits. So I went over them in the gameplay video, but he's got Immune, Contagions of Nurgle, Demon, Flying, Psyker, and Big Target. In terms of attacking this boss, the only restriction at the moment is that Death Guard characters cannot be used against him, but actually that's not that big of a deal because Death Guard are not being used a huge amount anyway. The first of his skills to look at is the Lantern, and this is the skill that I think is probably the most important and seems to be the skill that he casts most often. He targets a 3x3 area of effect and suppresses all targets within the area. He doesn't do any damage immediately, but does that energy damage after a delayed turn. However, all targets in the affected area are suppressed, reducing their damage and movement, and potentially if they have low movement characteristics or are in awkward terrain, they may not be able to escape the miasma, and therefore be hit and killed the following turn. My thoughts, this generally seems to occur on turn 1, at least that seems to have been the case in all of my testing, and I've done this about dozens, if not hundreds of times by now. That doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be the case, but he seems to open with this skill, and therefore you should plan accordingly. Do not clump up your units too much on approach. The next skill we'll look at is Reaping Scythe. You'll see the descriptor on the screen, but essentially Mortarion makes a melee attack against an adjacent enemy and does 7 times chain damage. He preferentially targets Psykers, and this is supposed to reflect Mortarion's hatred of Psykers. Theoretically, this could make Psykers less valuable, but I have a separate slide discussing Psykers later on, so I'll come back to this point. The final active ability for Mortarion is Plague Wind, and what this does is it does psychic damage to a target and then increasing psychic damage as the ability sort of chains away. There's not a huge amount to say to this. Essentially it functions identically to Typhus's Plague Wind, which is already in game. But the thing to highlight generally is that all 3 of these skills are theoretically cast relatively randomly, so it's difficult to predict when he's going to do Plague Wind versus the Lantern, but generally speaking all 3 of these skills are area of effect attacks and are incentives not to stack your units or clump them up too much. We're now on to his passives, and we'll start with Revoltingly Resilient, which is probably the most important of the passives because it totally changes the way we approach guild raid bosses. What Revoltingly Resilient does is it reduces the damage for multi-hits significantly. So basically every hit after the first attack, or first hit rather, starts to do exponentially less damage. Now you can sort of increase the threshold for this passive to trigger by defeating both primes, and you can go from 1 hit to 3 hits, but that's still not a huge amount, and generally is a move, or at least an attempt to move, towards fewer hits and higher pierce attacks. So theoretically what this does is it significantly weakens multi-hit and damage aura based strategies, and in a world where we're thinking about Eldryon and Athena and Calgar being sort of damage augmenters for multi-hit strategies, it's going to require an almost complete rethink and approach to our raid teams. However, I'm going to come back to this later on because there's something that you should all know for this coming patch that's really important, so just sort of put an asterisk next to what I've said for this slide. The next passive ability to speak about is Host of Plagues. What this does is it allows a 100% chance to spawn a Poxwalker on non-mechanical enemy death. So basically when your units die, a Poxwalker spawns. However, if you kill both primes, then you can reduce this 100% chance down to 10%, which I think is going to be pretty important given how strong the Poxwalkers are, and they can basically just one-shot each of your units independently. what do I think about this? The passive essentially means you have to kill the primes, and it makes mechanical units slightly better because they do not spawn poxwalkers, and that includes mechanical summons. The final passive ability is Arch Contaminator. What this does is it deals massive direct damage to melee units. We know that direct damage has a 100% pierce, so this is huge. However, by defeating both primes, you can reduce the number of hits this does from 7 down to 1, and summons take double damage. What does this mean? What are my thoughts? Essentially, melee units lose a huge amount of value against this boss. You basically can't bring them at all, unless they bring something pretty massive to the table. Possibly Helbrecht may have value, but I'm not convinced, and the fact that they've only got 1 or 2 turn survivability, rules them out completely. I think this passive means you have to approach this boss with ranged units, ideally with a reasonable amount of mobility, so you can sort of kite around him and dance around him in order to do your damage over 5 turns. In terms of the primes, we'll have a look at Rotbone first. His main mechanic that we need to be aware of is Boss Adjutant, which is the same mechanic that we saw for the Orc primes for Gazgul. Essentially what this means is that Rotbone takes reduced damage on direct hits, but procs 1% of his current health based on the number of times he was attacked each turn. This is a very similar approach to the Orc primes, but the key thing to know here, in case you or your guildmates don't know this already, is to coordinate with your allies and launch battles simultaneously for best results. What this means is that, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you could attack the boss at the same time, and all get to tick Boss Adjutant off at 100% health, rather than attacking him sequentially, which starts to have reducing returns on this 1% tick. So if you can coordinate, particularly on Discord, then this will give you much better returns on the boss. The other prime to talk about is Corrodius. So the main feature for Corrodius is his passive ability where he summons Poxwalkers on each of his turns. As I demonstrated during the gameplay video, trying to rush Corrodius and do damage to him is not going to work, as you're very quickly going to become overwhelmed and the Poxwalkers will start killing off your characters. I think, as I demonstrated during my gameplay video, the better strategy is probably going to be to stay back and pick them off using the sort of direct damage mechanic on this passive. By killing the Poxwalkers, you deal extra damage to Corrodius. So I think that's going to be the better approach. In terms of benefits that you get, killing both primes off is going to be pretty huge. You get a minus 90% chance to trigger Host of Plagues, which is the Poxwalker spawn passive. You increase the threshold from of Revoltingly Resilient from 1 to 3 hits. You reduce Arch Contaminator hits from 7 to 1. You give the boss Mortarion minus 90% armor, minus 25% damage, and reduce his movement by 1. And the bottom line is, this boss is so hard that I think you're going to have to just kill both primes, and there's no shortcuts around that. I'm trying to go through all this quickly so you're not here all day, so I'll just give you some very quick initial recommendations. So what's good and what's bad? As I've said, melee is going to be pretty awful against this boss. You're going to want to be in range. Poor movement is also going to mean that you can't dodge out of the way of his area of effect attacks. And his passive ability also means that characters that rely on multiple hits and who have a low pierce will not be able to maximize their damage potential adequately. Summoners who summon melee units like Archimatos and Bellator will also be penalized because the boss does bonus damage in melee against summons and will essentially one-shot everything after one turn. So what's good? I think you're going to want ranged units, I think you're going to want high pierce units, and also anyone who has anti-psyker traits or skills like Roswitha are going to be particularly valuable. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've hung around for all this time. You said, Nandi, you promised you were going to tell me about a bug, and it's going to be really important. So here we are. I'm upholding my word. There is a bug in the game at the moment that's been confirmed with the devs, and is something that will be available to not necessarily exploit, but take advantage of for the duration of this patch. And given how difficult I think this boss is going to be, definitely use this, because you're going to need all the help you can get. So we can go back and have a look at Revoltingly Resilient, which is a trait that reduces the amount of damage based on hits, and it should be an exponential damage reduction down to a minimum of 1. However, as you can see on screen on the top right hand side, we have a picture of Eldryon and Morgan Ra. If you look closely at the damage numbers in white text, you can see that the damage numbers are all roughly equal at about 720 odd. And that doesn't fit with Revoltingly Resilient. We would expect that the damage numbers would be reduced, with each hit. So what does that mean? Essentially, Revoltingly Resilient is not applying correctly to all damage boosting abilities. Crucially, this means that Eldryon, who is everyone's favourite raid character, is still going to have some use and viability for the coming weeks, I suppose. Eldryon is going to be great, it's going to be fantastic, and LD's passive still works. So I would suggest, at least in the initial forays into this boss, continue to bring Eldryon and continue to bring your multi-hitters in order to take advantage of that passive. Now this will change, this will get fixed, and when it does so, I think we'll need to reevaluate our approach and go back to my previous slide where I talked about high pierce, low hit characters maximizing their potential against Mortarion. Quickly, a note on Psykers. So, the Reaping Scythe ability for Mortarion theoretically makes bringing Psykers unappealing. However, Psykers also do 100% piercing damage, making them great against Mortarion's high armor. And if you go back to my recommendation slide, Psykers just naturally seem to fit a lot of the desirable traits for this boss. Additionally, we know that Reaping Scythe is cast randomly, i.e. it's not cast every single turn, and certainly isn't cast, at least in my testing, as a priority if you bring Psykers to the battlefield. We've seen in gameplay testing that whatever Mortarion does, somebody dies anyway. So is it really the end of the world if you bring a Psyker and there's a chance that they die? I would argue probably not, and Eldryon is so powerful, even with his reduced functionality against this boss, that I think there might be a case for him long term, but testing will tell. So there you go. Sorry it's such a long video, but this boss is complex and there's lots of stuff to talk about, lots of skills to break down, and I hope all that was useful to you. I'm sorry this isn't as polished as usual, but I'm juggling quite a few different videos, as I'm sure you'll have seen by now on my channel. And I hope that you guys all enjoyed that. If you do, please, I'd love to encourage you to use my Refer a Friend code, as you can see on screen. It really, really goes a long way in supporting me and allowing me to continue to do this type of content, because I love doing that, and I want to keep being here for you guys, for the community. Thank you all for your patience. Thanks for watching. I've got a final sign off here with the Pants of Horus guild cluster recruitment pitch. So if you're a player looking for a new guild and you want to make a move up to the competitive ranks, please reach out to us via Discord link below. Thanks everyone, that's all I've got today, and I hope you all have fun battling Mortarion. Bye now.